story of synthetic rubber, the story of one of the greatest achievements of mankind, the story of how conscientious chemists worked days and nights and years to create in the laboratory a material so much like natural rubber that it can be used successfully for almost every product formerly made of real rubber. The creation of a gigantic synthetic rubber industry was one of the world's great miracles, bringing this country safely through a dark crisis when it looked as though our national transportation system would collapse from lack of enough natural rubber for tires. The story we're about to tell concerns the two most widely used types of synthetic rubber. But before we take up this story, let's review a few of the facts about natural rubber. This is a piece of natural rubber. It's changed a lot from its original state. In fact, the material in this sheet of rubber started out in a tree thousands of miles away, tapped by a half-naked native in the Far East. Originally, it was a milky-looking fluid called latex. From this came a squunchy gum. About the only thing this gum was used for when it was first known was to rub out pencil marks. That's how it got its name, rubber. And then, in 1839, Charles Goodyear dropped some rubber and sulfur compound on a hot stove. The part exposed to the greatest heat did not melt. It charred instead. The part exposed to a lesser degree of heat was alive and elastic. Goodyear had accidentally discovered the secret of vulcanization. We Americans came to use more rubber than all the rest of the world put together. Of course, we had to bring most of it thousands of miles across the seas. But we didn't give that a thought until suddenly one day our rubber supply was cut off. The shock hit us where it hurt the most. Not in our pocketbooks, but in our automobiles. Then we, the people, screamed.
We have to have rubber for tires. Can't we get more from South America?
What about synthetic rubber? Can't they make tires out of that?
Making synthetic ought to be easy. Can't they make it out of milkweed?
Milkweed, goldenrod, plants like these are not sources of synthetic rubber. They are sources of real rubber. The trouble is, the amount of latex in such plants is so small and so hard to get that these plants may never become important factors. There are three plants that do hold out promise. They are the guayuli, transplanted from Mexico, Cryptostesia grandiflora from Madagascar, the Russian dandelion. But each presents a problem. For example, the guayuli shrub must be cultivated for several years before harvesting. Then the whole plant must be destroyed because the rubber is obtained by crushing the leaves, stems, and all to extract the latex. On the other hand, Cryptostesia grows rapidly and produces latex in a few months, and only the young stems and leaves need to be used. But the problem of extraction is even greater because the plant is much too small to be tapped and the crushing process is not efficient. Russian dandelion presents still other problems which have yet to be solved. But in spite of the constant research carried on by many agencies, including rubber companies, chemical companies, United States Department of Agriculture, and others, working together and independently, the rubber tree is still our most satisfactory source of natural rubber. It'll be a long time before shrubs and weeds yield enough to be more than a drop in the bucket as far as our national requirements are concerned. Our safest bet seems to be synthetic. Contrary to popular belief, synthetic rubber is not something new, nor was America asleep at the switch. We have been working on so-called synthetic rubber in this country for many years and making tires of it for a good part of that period. However, there was little real need for synthetic rubber. In fact, as late as 1930, books were written saying how foolish to waste time working on synthetic rubber when natural rubber was so cheap. But a few people over here held to the idea that America ought to be able to make its own rubber, just in case. But let's go back to the beginning. In 1826, Michael Faraday, son of an English blacksmith, ferreted out the composition of rubber. When he broke it down to its basic elements, he found them to be 5 atoms of carbon and 8 atoms of hydrogen, or as the chemist's shorthand writes it, C5H8 taken n times. In 1860, another English chemist, Greville Williams, distilled rubber, so to speak, by heating it. The result was a clear liquid which he called isoprene. Its basic elements were the same as those found in rubber. Williams put his bottle of isoprene on the shelf and forgot it. Months later, he discovered the clear liquid had changed back into a gummy substance resembling rubber. But it wasn't rubber itself. They could break down natural rubber to its basic molecules and rebuild it into artificial rubber. But they couldn't rebuild it into real rubber, nor could they make artificial rubber out of non-rubber ingredients. So these early scientists started looking for carbon and hydrogen compounds in non-rubber sources. In 1892, Sir William Tilden found what they were all looking for. Experimenting with a derivative from turpentine, he produced the first rubber-like material from a non-rubber source. By 1912, in Europe, a few experimental tires had been made out of a synthetic rubber and were used in the First World War. But they were so inferior to other tires that the formula for them hasn't been used since 1918. After the war, American chemists in widely divergent industries went quietly to work to find out more about this substitute for rubber. In 1927, they found and applied for patents on a process that is the underlying principle of much of the important synthetic rubber manufactured today. We call what they have made synthetic rubber. That is its accepted name. Synthetic rubber is defined as a substance from non-rubber sources capable of being vulcanized and having many other rubber-like qualities. It looks like rubber, it feels like rubber, it smells like rubber, and it wears like rubber. In some ways it's better than rubber, some ways not so good. But it really never has been rubber. For like Humpty Dumpty, though they broke rubber down to its basic elements, all the king's chemists and all the king's men couldn't put the molecules back together again exactly as they were originally. Nature still held the secret of rubber structure. This was the first complete plant in the United States to produce one of the 2 most important types of synthetic rubber. This synthetic rubber proved to be even better than natural rubber in many ways. It did not soften and go mushy in contact with oil and gasoline like natural rubber. Later, tires made of synthetic rubber, produced by an emulsification process as developed in 1927, proved comparable to those made of natural rubber. This was proved by the most grueling tests. But a synthetic tire back in those days would have cost twice as much as one of natural rubber. We think you'll agree that few motorists would have paid the difference. So the use of synthetic rubber was restricted to applications where its advantages justified the price, notably gasoline and fuel oil hose, bullet puncture sealing gas tanks, and hose for warplanes. That was the real situation when our supply of natural rubber was cut off. So you see, we had synthetic rubber. We'd been making it commercially for many years. Not only the rubber industry, but oil companies and chemical concerns as well, making all the country needed at the time. But all those companies put together hadn't enough of the special, complicated equipment to jump production from the normal 4,000 tons a year to several 100,000 long tons a year, synthetic's part in meeting the emergency quota of more than 800,000 long tons. In addition to this being an abnormal requirement, we must realize that you don't get synthetic rubber simply by pouring together 2 liquids, regardless of the newsreel stunts. That's only one and the easiest step. In the first place, synthetic rubber is made from materials that are a far cry from the rubber tree. The 2 main substitutes for the rubber plantation are the oil fields and the grain fields. The oil fields yield petroleum, The grain fields provide the source of alcohol. Both contain compounds composed of carbon and hydrogen, although the hydrogen and carbon is not in the same ratio as found in rubber. The trick is to do a Humpty Dumpty, put back together again the molecules of carbon and hydrogen taken from petroleum or alcohol, so they are in a proportion that enables them to hook up like those in rubber itself. Now let's see how this is done. The oil goes to the refinery for distilling and cracking. At one step, by one process, we get butane, a light gas which for years was a big waste byproduct in the making of gasoline. Further processing produces the principal ingredient for synthetic rubber, butadiene, with a chemical makeup of 4 parts of carbon and 6 parts of hydrogen. You see, we're getting close to the structure of the molecules of rubber hydrocarbons, which is 5 parts of carbon to 8 of hydrogen. Now let's take the grain, corn, wheat, or rye, or even potatoes, sugarcane, or molasses. They go to the distillery for fermenting and distilling to alcohol. The alcohol goes through its chemical processes till it too is changed to butadiene. Now, is there any difference, you ask, between the butadiene made from alcohol and butadiene from oil? None whatever. They both work the same, and you can't tell the difference. As presently scheduled, about 2/3 of our butadiene will come from oil and 1/3 from alcohol. This proportion may be changed either way as our national economy seems to dictate. It takes 3 6/10 gallons of liquefied butane to make enough butadiene for 1 616 tire, or 1 7/10 bushels of grain for the same amount. The butadiene, from either petroleum or grain, is shipped to the synthetic plant where it is transferred to big tanks, and either styrene or acrylonitrile added, according to the type of synthetic desired. The butadiene-styrene mixture goes through the various stages of chemical reaction, is finally coagulated, and comes out synthetic rubber S-type. The S is for styrene. This type of rubber is best for tires. The butadiene and acrylonitrile go through the same processes and come out synthetic N, the N for nitrile. This kind of oil-resistant rubber is the synthetic that's best for airplane tanks and hose. Now let's go into the plant and see these processes in action. While we're approaching the rapidly expanding plants, you'd better get your birth certificate and fingerprints ready. You'll need them for your pass to get in. And this is a good time to answer a question you've probably asked many times. Why don't the companies that make the butadiene make the synthetic rubber? Why is it left largely to the rubber companies? Because the rubber companies have the know-how, just as the baker has more know-how in cake making than the miller who grinds the flour. On the other hand, the rubber companies were glad to have the oil and chemical industries go into the large-scale production of butadiene, styrene, acrylonitrile, and other raw materials. But here we are at the parent plant. This is the big tank where the butadiene and styrene are blended. Butadiene and styrene do not normally mix with water any better than oil mixes with it. So we put in a soapy solution and emulsify them. Then they mix with water as readily as oil does when you add it to soap suds. Next, butadiene and styrene, measured to exact proportions, according to the rubber properties desired, are added. Then in goes another ingredient to make the mixture react, like yeast added to dough makes it ferment. Chemists call this ingredient a catalyst. The 5 ingredients, butadiene, styrene, water, soap suds, and catalyst, are all churned together under precision-controlled temperature and pressure for 10 to 15 hours. Now, if we could peer into this tank with a powerful X-ray eye, we would see tiny molecules linking themselves together, end to end, to make giant molecules. They look a little like chains of rubber bands, and the longer they are, the more rubbery they become. We don't dare let them cross-link very much. We have to keep them end to end, so they will be rubbery. When these molecules hitch themselves together to form a stretchy unit, they lose their individuality as hydrocarbons and become a polymer, meaning a giant molecule made up of many small ones. At the present moment, the chemical reaction is halted. The batch of churned liquid is drawn off into another tank and ingredients added to improve the aging properties of the rubber. This is synthetic latex, minute particles of synthetic rubber in suspension, like butter, fat, and milk. Now, when reaction is stopped, some of the butadiene and styrene remain unused, like bits of butter fat that float in the milk after the butter is churned. These are removed from the synthetic latex in this still. The coagulating agent is added, and this separates the particles of synthetic rubber from the latex and forms a soft mass. This is the step, incidentally, which is shown by newsreels when they picture two liquids being poured together to make synthetic rubber. You see now why we said that making synthetic rubber was a lot more complicated than just pouring together two liquids. The new synthetic is washed, shredded, and dried in crumb form. That is what is called crumb rubber. It is pressed into bales or sheets. Looks exactly like bales or sheets of crude rubber. In fact, for all general purposes, it is similar to crude rubber. It can be processed the same as natural rubber on the same machines, which is important, since some synthetic requires special equipment, a handicap when you have to make a quick changeover. And it can be vulcanized, another imperative requirement. Here is a piece of synthetic rubber. Notice how it stretches and snaps. This piece of natural rubber behaves in about the same fashion. All right then, if synthetic and natural rubber are almost the same, what is the difference between them? Natural rubber softens and swells in contact with oil. It melts at high temperatures or goes brittle at low. It cuts easily when wet. We corrected these faults as much as we could, but there are only a certain number of ways you can correct the faults of tree rubber. However, there are many ways in which you can change synthetic rubber. You can build in desirable qualities and eliminate undesirable ones. For example, the synthetic rubber made with butadiene and styrene has qualities that make it best for tires. But by polymerizing or combining butadiene with acrylonitrile instead of styrene, we get a type of synthetic that is highly oil resistant. For instance, here is a piece of natural rubber, and here is a piece of oil-resistant synthetic, exactly the same size. We're going to put them both in a jar of gasoline and let them stand a little while. A few hours later, we remove the pieces to find out how much the gasoline has affected them. The natural rubber is all soft, mushy, and swelled up, while the oil-resistant synthetic shows almost no change. This is the type of synthetic that made possible the bullet puncture-sealing gas tanks of our warplanes. Is this important? I'll say it is. In the First World War, 75% of the planes we lost were downed or set afire by bullets through the gas tank. The government offered a reward for a method of saving planes from this hazard. This is it. These Army test pictures show what happens when the rubber-lined fuel tanks are riddled with bullets. Practically nothing. But watch this old-style metal tank. No wonder we remember them as flaming coffins. Here in cross-section is how the bullet puncture-sealing tank works. Oil-resistant synthetic, impervious to gasoline, lines the inside. Behind it is a filling of natural rubber, or of soft oil swelling synthetic. A bullet enters, slow motion on one side, and comes out on the other. Now watch that natural rubber core when the gasoline reaches it. It swells almost instantly and plugs the holes. That's turning one of tree rubber weaknesses to an advantage when backed up by synthetic. Yes, we're compounding synthetics to excel natural rubber in more ways all the time. Synthetics are still not as elastic as tree rubber, and the larger all-synthetic truck tires still heat up, but so did the first truck tires made of natural rubber. Engineers licked that problem, and they'll iron out this one too. This brings us to the end of our film. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the day of miracles is past, or that there's any obstacle that American ingenuity cannot surmount. Fascinating problems are all around us, just waiting to be solved. Spectacular victories, like the victory of synthetic rubber, just waiting to be won. We Americans have proved there's no such word as can't, and that we do have dominion over the forces of nature.